Stop. What you're about to hear could forever change everything you thought you knew about one of humanity's most controversial stories. And I'm warning you now, once you know this truth, you won't be able to go back. Did you know there is a gospel that could completely rewrite the history of Christianity? A text that was buried for almost 2,000 years, silenced, forbidden, deliberately hidden from your eyes and from the eyes of the entire world. A document that not only challenges everything you were taught in church, but also reveals a truth so powerful, so disturbing, that religious authorities did everything possible to prevent it from reaching your hands. I'm talking about the Gospel of Judas. And no, it's not fiction, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's a real, authentic document that was discovered and contains revelations that will shake the foundations of your faith. But before we continue, I need you to understand something very important. What you're about to hear, almost no one dares to share. Why? Because it directly challenges the foundations of the religious power that has controlled our minds for centuries, because it reveals secrets that certain groups prefer to keep hidden, and because, frankly, most people aren't prepared to face a truth of this magnitude. Look, all your life you've been told the same story. Judas Iscariot, the traitor. The man who sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. The disciple who sealed Christ's fate with a kiss. The very personification of betrayal, greed, and human evil. His name has become synonymous with treason in virtually every language in the world. But what if all that was a lie? What if I told you there is documented evidence, real tangible evidence, that suggests Judas wasn't the traitor you've been led to believe? What would you think if I revealed to you that, according to authentic ancient texts, Judas may have actually been Jesus' most faithful disciple, the one closest to him, the only one who truly understood his mission? What if the betrayal was never a betrayal? I know that right now your mind is processing this information, and you're probably feeling a mix of disbelief, curiosity, and maybe even some resistance. That's normal. For decades, centuries, we've been programmed to believe a specific version of events. But today, here and now, we're going to dismantle that programming piece by piece. The Gospel of Judas is not just any book. It's a manuscript dating back to the 2nd or 3rd century AD, written in Coptic, a language of ancient Egypt. It was discovered in the 1970s in an Egyptian cave, but its existence was kept secret for decades. Why? Because its content is absolutely revolutionary. This gospel presents a completely different version of the events leading to Jesus' crucifixion. A version where Judas acts not out of greed or betrayal, but on direct instructions from Jesus himself. A version where handing Jesus over to the authorities was not an act of betrayal, but part of a larger divine plan, a plan that only Judas was capable of understanding and executing. Imagine for a moment the implications of this. If this version is true, it means that for 2,000 years we have been unfairly judging a man who, far from being a traitor, was the most obedient and faithful disciple. It means that the history we know has been deliberately distorted. It means that someone at some point in history decided that this truth was too dangerous to be known. But who would make such a decision? Who would have the power and authority to hide an entire gospel? And why would they do it? The answers to these questions will surprise you. They will disturb you. And they will forever change the way you view not just Judas, not just Jesus, but the entire structure of Christianity as you know it. Because you see, the Gospel of Judas isn't just a different story about a biblical character. It's a window into a completely different understanding of what it truly means to be a follower of Christ. It's a revelation about the true nature of spirituality, about the kingdom of God that Jesus preached, and about the methods religious institutions have used for centuries to control and manipulate the masses. This gospel speaks of concepts that go far beyond what any traditional church would dare to teach. It speaks of the inner divinity of the human being. It speaks of the liberation of the soul from material limitations. It speaks of esoteric truths that were considered heretical by the religious authorities of the time. And here's the most striking thing of all. These teachings don't contradict Jesus' message. On the contrary, they complete it. They deepen it. They give it a context and a dimension that the official version of Christianity has systematically eliminated. So, are you ready to learn the truth? Are you ready to face the possibility that everything you thought you knew about one of history's most controversial figures is completely false? Do you have the courage to question centuries of religious dogma and open your mind to a reality that could transform your spiritual understanding forever. Because once we cross this line, once we open this door, there will be no turning back. The truth, when finally revealed, has the power to set you free, but also to shatter the comfortable illusions you've lived under your entire life. The choice is yours. You can close this video right now and continue living with the official version of events. Or you can stay with me for the next few minutes and discover a truth that has been hidden for nearly 2 millennia. What do you choose? I see you've chosen to stay. And that tells me something very important about you. It tells me that you're a brave person, someone who doesn't settle for superficial answers, someone who has the courage to seek the truth, even when that truth may be uncomfortable. If you've ever felt like the faith you were taught doesn't answer your deepest questions, this video is for you. If you've ever lain awake at night wondering why certain things in the Bible don't make complete sense, why some teachings seem contradictory, why you feel like there are missing pieces to the spiritual puzzle, then you've come to the right place. Because let me tell you something that perhaps no one else has dared to tell you. Your doubts are valid, your questions are legitimate, and that feeling you have, that intuition that something important has been hidden from you, you're right. For years, millions of people like you have felt this same restlessness. They have gone to their pastors, their priests, their religious leaders with profound questions, seeking real answers, and have received in return empty phrases like, "You must have faith," "Don't question divine mysteries," or "Some things are not meant to be understood by the human mind." But you know what? Those aren't answers. They're evasions. They're ways to keep you in the dark, to keep you from digging too deep, to prevent you from discovering truths that could change your life forever. You deserve more than that. You deserve real answers. You deserve to know the whole truth, not an edited and censored version designed to keep you obedient and unchallenged. And this is where everything changes. This is where your spiritual quest takes a completely new direction, because you are not alone on this journey. We are thousands, millions of people around the world who have decided to awaken, who have chosen to seek the truth no matter how disturbing it may be. We form a community of seekers, of courageous souls who refuse to settle for easy answers. We are brothers and sisters in this search for authentic spiritual truth, and every day, every week, we discover new revelations that transform our understanding of the divine. The Gospel of Judas is just the beginning. It's just the tip of the iceberg of a spiritual reality far vaster, far more beautiful and far more liberating than you've ever been allowed to imagine. But to be part of this community, to receive these life-changing revelations, you need to make a decision right now. You need to demonstrate that you are truly committed to the pursuit of truth. That's why I'm asking you to do something very simple, but very important. Subscribe to this channel right now and activate the notification bell. Because here, each video is another key to your spiritual awakening. Every revelation I share with you has been carefully researched, verified, and presented in a way that you can understand and apply in your life. It's not just information, it's transformation. It's not just historical data, it's tools for your spiritual liberation. When you subscribe, you're not just following a YouTube channel, you're joining a quiet revolution. You're becoming part of a global movement of people who have decided they will no longer accept lies disguised as religious dogma. Every subscriber who joins us is another light in the darkness, another voice saying no to spiritual manipulation, another soul who has chosen truth over comfort. And let me be completely honest with you, not everyone is ready for this journey. Some people prefer to live in ignorance because the truth requires courage. It requires you to change. It requires you to question everything you thought you knew. But you are different. If you've come this far, if you've stayed with me these minutes, it's because your soul is ready to awaken. It's because you carry within you that divine spark that seeks authentic truth, not the cheap imitations you've been sold for years. That's why I invite you, I beg you, I implore you. Don't waste this opportunity. Don't let fear or doubt prevent you from taking this fundamental step. Subscribe now. Do it for yourself. Do it for your spiritual growth. Do it because you deserve to know the truth. Because once you become part of this community, once you have access to these revelations that have been hidden for centuries, your life will never be the same. Your faith will become more authentic, deeper, more personal. You will no longer depend on what others tell you to believe. You will have your own direct connection to the divine. And that, brother, that is true spiritual freedom. Look, I know you might have doubts. Maybe you're wondering if it's really worth it. Maybe you think you've watched enough YouTube channels on spiritual topics, and they all say the same thing. But I assure you, this is different. Here you won't find repetitive sermons or superficial interpretations of biblical texts. Here you'll find serious research, real historical documents, revelations that have been verified by scholars and archaeologists. Here you will find the truth that religious institutions don't want you to know. Every video I publish is the result of hours, sometimes weeks of research. I read ancient manuscripts, consult scholarly sources, and verify historical data. I don't share anything with you that hasn't been rigorously researched and validated, because I respect your intelligence. Because I know you deserve quality information, not empty speculation or unfounded theories. So do it now. While you feel this energy, this excitement of being on the verge of discovering something extraordinary, click the subscribe button, turn on notifications. Join us in this search for authentic spiritual truth, because the video that comes next, brother, what I'm going to reveal to you about the Gospel of Judas is going to revolutionize your understanding of the entire Christian story. You can't miss it. Now that you're part of this community of truth seekers, it's time to delve into one of the most fascinating and disturbing mysteries in the entire history of Christianity. A mystery that has literally been buried beneath the sands of the Egyptian desert for nearly 2,000 years. For centuries, this gospel remained lost in the dust of time, hidden, silenced, erased from humanity's collective memory. But why? What did this text contain that was so dangerous, so threatening to the authorities of the time, that they decided to completely eliminate it from official history? The answer to that question will reveal to you the magnitude of the manipulation that spiritual truth has suffered for centuries. Imagine the scene. We're in the early centuries of Christianity. The new faith is spreading throughout the Roman Empire like wildfire. There are dozens, perhaps hundreds of texts circulating among early Christian communities. Gospels, letters, revelations, teachings attributed to Jesus and his apostles. But not all of these texts tell the same story. Not all of them present the same version of events. And this is where the problem begins for those seeking power and control. You see, among all these ancient texts, the Gospel of Judas stood out for one very specific reason. It presented a completely different view of the relationship between Jesus and Judas Iscariot. A view that didn't fit with the official narrative that certain religious leaders wanted to establish. This gospel did not portray Judas as the villain of the story. Quite the opposite. It presented him as Jesus' closest disciple, the only one who truly understood the Master's deepest teachings. It portrayed him not as a traitor driven by greed, but as an initiate into spiritual mysteries that the other disciples could not comprehend. Can you imagine the implications of this? If this version of events became widely accepted, the entire doctrinal edifice that was being built around official Christianity would collapse. They couldn't allow that to happen. They couldn't allow an alternative version of events to exist that would challenge their authority, their interpretation of events, their monopoly on spiritual truth. So they made a decision that would change the course of human spiritual history forever. They decided that certain texts would be considered canonical, that is, official, authentic, divinely inspired, and other texts would be declared apocryphal, false, heretical, dangerous. The Gospel of Judas fell into this second category, not because it was less authentic than the other Gospels, nor because it was less ancient or less historically reliable, but because it contained truths that threatened the political and religious power of the time. And so this extraordinary text was condemned to oblivion. Copies were destroyed. Christians who dared to read or quote it were persecuted as heretics. Its very existence was erased from official records. For more than 1,700 years, the Gospel of Judas existed only as a reference in a few ancient texts. Scholars knew it had existed, but they had no access to its contents. It was like a ghost of history, a shadow of what it once was. Until the 1970s, in a remote region of Egypt, some farmers made a discovery that would change everything. While working in their fields, they found an ancient clay jar buried in the sand. Inside that jar was a treasure more valuable than gold, a papyrus manuscript written in the ancient Coptic language. It was the Gospel of Judas. After nearly 2 millennia of being lost, it had returned to the light. But even after its discovery, the text remained a secret for decades. Why? because those who found it immediately understood the magnitude of what they had in their hands. They knew this document had the power to completely revolutionize our understanding of early Christianity. They knew there were truths in that text that certain power groups would prefer to keep hidden forever. For years, the gospel passed from hand to hand on the black market for antiquities. Private collectors, academics, and religious institutions all sought to control it. They all understood its value, not only historical but also political and spiritual. Finally, after decades of negotiations, the text was handed over to an international team of experts for translation and analysis. And when they were finally able to read its full content, when they were able to understand what it really said, the world was never the same again. Because what they found in those ancient pages wasn't just a different story about Judas. It was a window into a completely different understanding of Jesus' teachings. It was a revelation about the nature of spirituality, about the purpose of human existence, about the relationship between the divine and the earthly. It was a spiritual time bomb that had been waiting for 2,000 years to explode. And today, at this moment, you are about to witness that explosion. You're about to learn secrets that have been hidden for centuries. You're about to discover truths that will forever transform your understanding of faith, spirituality, and your own purpose in this world. But before revealing the specific content of this extraordinary gospel, you need to understand the historical context in which it was written. You need to understand the political and religious forces that conspired to keep it hidden. Because only when you understand the magnitude of the manipulation that spiritual truth has suffered, only then will you be able to fully appreciate the revolutionary power of what you are about to discover. Get ready, because what comes next is going to change everything you thought you knew about the most important story ever told. To fully understand the magnitude of what you're about to discover, we need to travel back in time. We need to transport ourselves to the first centuries after Christ, when Christianity was still a young, diverse faith, full of different interpretations of Jesus' teachings. Imagine the world of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. There was no official Bible. There was no unified Christian doctrine. Early Christian communities were like islands, scattered in an ocean of oral traditions, sacred texts, and mystical interpretations that circulated freely among believers. In this context, the Gospel of Judas was not an anomaly. It was part of a rich tradition of Gnostic texts that presented a more esoteric, deeper view of Christ's teachings. Gnostics believed that Jesus had shared secret knowledge with his closest disciples, knowledge that went far beyond the public teachings contained in the canonical Gospels. But this is where the story takes a dark turn. As Christianity gained political power, especially after Emperor Constantine declared it the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, certain religious leaders saw the need to create a unified, controlled, and above all, controllable doctrine. It was then that the famous Council of Nicaea was convened in 325 AD. Officially, this council met to resolve doctrinal disputes and create unity in the Church. But in reality, what they did was something far more significant and more disturbing. They decided which version of the truth would be the official one. At those meetings, a small group of powerful men made decisions that would affect humanity's spirituality for the next 2,000 years. They decided which texts would be included in what we now know as the Bible, and which would be discarded, banned, and declared heretical. It wasn't a decision based on the historical authenticity of the texts. It wasn't a decision based on their antiquity or their proximity to the original events. It was a political decision, a decision of power, a decision designed to create a version of Christianity that would be useful for maintaining social and religious control. The Gospel of Judas, along with dozens of other Gnostic texts, was declared heretical. Why? Because it presented a vision of spirituality that was too personal, too direct, too empowering for individuals. Gnostic texts taught that every person could have a direct relationship with the divine, without the need for institutional intermediaries. This was extremely dangerous for a church that was building its power precisely on the basis of being the only valid intermediary between God and humanity. Then began what can only be described as a systematic campaign of destruction. Copies of the Gospel of Judas were burned. Christians who dared to read or teach it were persecuted, tortured, and often executed as heretics. The libraries containing these texts were looted and destroyed. The Gnostic community in Egypt, which had preserved many of these sacred texts, was brutally suppressed. Their monasteries were closed, their spiritual leaders were killed or exiled, and their sacred texts were systematically eliminated. But some of these texts managed to survive. Brave monks, believers committed to preserving the complete truth, hid copies of these Gospels in clay jars and buried them in the desert, hoping that one day, when it was safe, they could be rediscovered. The Gospel of Judas was one of these saved texts. For nearly 1,600 years, it lay buried in the sands of Egypt, preserved by the dry desert climate, waiting for the right moment to return to light. When it was finally discovered in the 1970s, the academic and religious world panicked. Here was an authentic text from the 2nd or 3rd century that presented a completely different version of one of the most important events in Christian history. But even after its discovery, the Gospel continued to be suppressed. For decades, it was kept in private collections, away from scholarly scrutiny. Only in 2006, more than 30 years after its discovery, was the full text finally translated and made public. And when experts were able to analyze its contents, when they were able to compare it with other texts of the time, when they were able to verify its authenticity through carbon-14 dating and paleographic analysis, they came to a startling conclusion. This Gospel was not only authentic, but it was probably as old and as historically reliable as any of the canonical Gospels. But its content was revolutionary. It presented Judas not as the greedy traitor of official tradition, but as the most initiated disciple, the only one who had understood Jesus' deepest teachings. It showed that Judas's betrayal had not been a betrayal at all, but the fulfillment of a sacred mission entrusted to him by Jesus himself. Furthermore, the Gospel contained esoteric teachings about the nature of the soul, about spiritual liberation, about the relationship between the material world and the spiritual world that went far beyond anything you will find in the official Gospels. These teachings painted a picture of Jesus not just as a spiritual master, but as an initiate into profound cosmic mysteries, someone who had come to reveal not just a path to salvation, but the path to complete human enlightenment. And here's the most disturbing thing of all. When you compare these teachings with other ancient spiritual traditions, when you analyze them in the context of the esoteric wisdom of the time, it all begins to make perfect sense. It all connects in a way that the official version of Christianity has never managed. It's as if you finally have all the pieces of the puzzle. As if after 2,000 years of confusion and conflicting interpretations, you can finally see the complete picture of what Jesus really taught. And that, brother, that's exactly what religious authorities have feared for centuries. That one day, the missing pieces of the puzzle would be found. That one day the full truth would come to light. But that day has arrived, and you are part of the first generation in 2,000 years to have access to this complete truth. Now I want to know your opinion on this. Tell me in the comments, do you think the story of Judas was deliberately manipulated by religious authorities? Do you think other spiritual truths have been similarly hidden? I'd love to hear your perspective on this, because each of you brings unique wisdom to this conversation. And now that you know the historical context, now that you understand the forces that conspired to hide this gospel, you are ready to learn its specific content. You are ready to discover exactly what this extraordinary text says about Jesus, about Judas, and about the true nature of spirituality. The time has come. After establishing the historical context, after understanding the forces that conspired to suppress this text, it's time to delve into the specific content of the Gospel of Judas. And I warn you, what you're about to hear will challenge every fiber of your traditional religious understanding. The Gospel begins in a way that immediately sets a completely different tone from the canonical texts. It doesn't present Judas as just another of the 12 disciples, but as someone special, someone set apart, someone with whom Jesus has private conversations that the other disciples cannot understand. According to this text, Jesus approaches Judas privately and tells him something absolutely extraordinary. You will surpass them all, for you will sacrifice the man who clothes me. This phrase alone completely revolutionizes the traditional narrative. Jesus not only knows in advance what Judas is going to do, but he is specifically instructing him to do it. But here comes the most shocking part. According to the Gospel, Jesus explains to Judas that his physical body is only a temporary garment, a material prison that limits his true divine essence. The crucifixion is not a sacrifice for humanity's sins, as we have been taught, but an act of cosmic liberation, a way to free the eternal Christ from the limitations of human flesh. This interpretation changes absolutely everything. It means that Judas is not betraying Jesus, but helping him fulfill a spiritual mission that transcends ordinary human understanding. He is participating in a cosmic mystery where physical death is simply a transition to a higher existence. The Gospel describes intimate conversations between Jesus and Judas, where the Master reveals knowledge he had kept hidden from the other disciples. He speaks about the illusory nature of the material world, about the existence of multiple dimensions of reality, and about the true nature of the human soul, which goes far beyond what any traditional religion has taught. Jesus explains to Judas that the kingdom of God is not a physical place you will go to after death, but a state of consciousness you can achieve here and now. He teaches him that every human being carries within them a divine spark, a fragment of God himself, and that the purpose of existence is to awaken to that inner divinity. But here's the part that's most threatening to religious institutions. According to the Gospel, this spiritual enlightenment requires no intermediaries. You don't need priests, you don't need churches, you don't need religious institutions to directly access the divine. The path to God is within yourself. The text describes how Jesus leads Judas through mystical visions where he shows him the hidden structure of the cosmos. He reveals that there are multiple levels of reality inhabited by different orders of spiritual beings. He teaches him that what we perceive as physical reality is only the most superficial layer of an infinitely vast and complex universe. In one of the most extraordinary sections of the Gospel, Jesus explains to Judas that the God of the Old Testament, the God who created the material world, is not the true supreme God, but a lesser being, a demiurge, who created this material reality as a kind of spiritual prison. The true God, according to these teachings, completely transcends material creation and can only be known through direct mystical experience. This revelation is absolutely revolutionary because it means that the entire theological structure of traditional Christianity is based on an incomplete understanding of spiritual reality. It means that we have been worshipping a limited version of the divine, while the true source of all existence remains hidden beyond the veil of ordinary perception. The Gospel also contains specific teachings about the nature of the human soul. According to Jesus, each person possesses not only one soul, but multiple spiritual aspects that correspond to different levels of consciousness. Some of these aspects are trapped in material illusion, while others maintain a direct connection to the higher dimensions of reality. The mission of every human being, according to these teachings, is to reunite these fragmented aspects of their being and awaken to their full divine nature. This is not achieved through blind faith or obedience to religious dogma, but through direct knowledge, mystical experience, and inner transformation. Judas asks Jesus about the fate of those who fail to achieve this awakening, and the answer is fascinating. Jesus explains that unawakened souls remain trapped in cycles of material reincarnation, condemned to repeat the same lessons over and over again until they finally achieve enlightenment. This teaching about reincarnation, of course, is completely foreign to official Christianity, but perhaps the most disturbing revelation of the Gospel is the way it portrays the other disciples. According to the text, Peter, James, John, and the others do not truly understand Jesus' teachings. They are trapped in literal and material interpretations of his words. Only Judas has been initiated into the deeper mysteries. In a particularly dramatic scene, the Gospel describes how the other disciples have visions where they see themselves as priests officiating sacrifices in a great temple. When they tell this vision to Jesus, he responds sadly, explaining that they have seen the future of what Christianity will become, an institutionalized religion based on empty rituals and symbolic sacrifices, rather than the authentic spiritual transformation he truly taught. This prophecy of Jesus, according to the Gospel, has been fulfilled exactly. Christianity has become precisely what he predicted, a religion of temples, priests, and rituals that keeps people away from the direct experience of the divine. The Gospel culminates with Jesus specifically instructing Judas on how to proceed with the betrayal. He explains that this seemingly terrible act is actually the greatest act of love he can perform, because it will not only free the cosmic Christ from the limitations of the flesh, but will also initiate a chain of events that will eventually lead to the full revelation of these secret teachings. Jesus tells Judas, "You will be cursed by the generations to come, but in the end you will reign over them all." This promise suggests that there will come a time in history when the truth about Judas will finally be revealed, and his true role will be understood and honored. And here we are, 2,000 years later, witnessing exactly that revelation. The Gospel ends with Judas receiving a final vision in which he sees the future. He sees how his name will be vilified for millennia, how he will be remembered as the greatest traitor in history. But he also sees that eventually the truth will come out, and his sacrifice will be understood for what it truly was. When you analyze all this content together, when you compare it with the Gnostic teachings of the time, when you examine it from the perspective of universal esoteric traditions, everything begins to make perfect sense. It's as if you finally have access to the complete teachings of Jesus, not just the fragments that survived institutional censorship. But the implications of all this go far beyond academic theology. If these teachings are authentic, if they truly represent what Jesus taught his closest disciples, then it means that for 2,000 years we have been following an incomplete, censored and distorted version of his message. It means that true Christianity, the Christianity that Jesus actually taught, is something completely different from what we know today. Now that you know the true content of the Gospel of Judas, it's time to expose something even more disturbing: how religious institutions deliberately transformed Judas Iscariot into the perfect villain to serve their own political and psychological interests. This transformation was not accidental. It was not the result of historical misunderstandings or misinterpretations. It was a calculated strategy, specifically designed to create an external enemy that would keep the faithful united under institutional control. Think about it for a moment. What does any powerful organization need to keep its followers obedient and disciplined? It needs a common enemy. It needs a figure who represents everything wrong, everything they should fear, everything they must reject to stay within the fold. Judas became that perfect figure. His story was carefully shaped to represent the temptations every Christian should avoid: greed, betrayal, lack of faith. By turning him into the archetype of Christian evil, church authorities created an extremely powerful psychological tool of social control. But the manipulation was far more sophisticated than simply creating a villain. The early churches needed to justify their own authority. They needed to explain why they, and only they, had the right to interpret Christ's teachings. How did they do this? By creating a narrative in which the only trustworthy disciples were those who founded the institutions they themselves led. Peter became the founder of the Roman Catholic Church. James became the leader of the Jerusalem Church. John became the author of the spiritual gospel. But Judas had to be removed from this line of apostolic succession because the teachings he had received from Jesus were too dangerous for the institutional power. The Gnostic teachings that Judas had preserved promoted direct spiritual experience, personal enlightenment, and individual connection with the divine. These ideas were absolutely incompatible with a church that needed to position itself as the only valid intermediary between God and humanity. Then began what can only be described as a systematic smear campaign. Later, church writers not only omitted Judas's teachings, but actively distorted his role in the events. They took the most sublime act of spiritual obedience and transformed it into the ultimate symbol of human betrayal. Irenaeus of Lyons, one of the early church fathers, wrote extensively against Gnostic texts in the 2nd century. His work against heresies was not simply a theological refutation. It was a manual of spiritual warfare designed to completely eradicate any alternative interpretation of Christianity. In his writings, Irenaeus specifically describes the Gospel of Judas as an impious fiction invented by heretics to confuse the faithful. But here's the telling point. Irenaeus had clearly read the entire text. He knew its contents in detail. His condemnation wasn't based on ignorance, but on an accurate understanding of how threatening this gospel was to the power structure he represented. Origen of Alexandria, another influential 3rd century theologian, took this campaign even further. He developed an entire theology on the nature of evil that placed Judas as the perfect example of how human freedom can be corrupted by demonic forces. This interpretation not only justified the condemnation of Judas, but also established a theological precedent for condemning anyone who questioned ecclesiastical authority. But the most subtle and effective manipulation came with the development of the doctrine of original sin. By establishing that all humans are born fundamentally corrupt, religious authorities created a narrative in which Judas's betrayal was not just a specific historical event, but a representation of fundamental human nature. This doctrine served a dual purpose. First, it made all believers feel potentially capable of the same betrayal, creating a collective guilt that only the church could absolve. Second, it established that human nature was so corrupt that it required constant oversight by religious authorities. The story of Judas became the perfect example of why individuals could not trust their own spiritual experience, why they needed institutional mediation to avoid falling into heresy and damnation. Over the following centuries, this narrative was refined and amplified through art, literature, and sermons. Medieval depictions of Judas portrayed him with stereotypical physical characteristics that reinforced anti-Semitic prejudices, linking his supposed betrayal to his ethnic origins and creating a theological basis for centuries of persecution. Medieval mystery plays dramatized his treachery in ever more elaborate ways, portraying him not just as a traitor, but as an almost demonic being whose evil was so fundamental that it manifested itself even in his physical appearance. But perhaps the most insidious manipulation was the way church authorities used the story of Judas to discourage any form of theological questioning. Any Christian who expressed doubts about official doctrine, anyone who sought alternative interpretations of Christ's teachings, could be accused of following the way of Judas. This tactic was extremely effective because it created a deep fear of independent spiritual exploration. Believers learned to self-censor, to repress their genuine doubts and questions, for fear of being associated with the archetypal traitor. The final canonization of the Gospels in the 4th century completed this manipulation. By officially establishing which texts were divinely inspired and which were heretical, the authorities not only controlled the narrative about Judas, but also eliminated any evidence that might contradict his version of events. The scribes who copied the biblical manuscripts received specific instructions on how to emphasize certain aspects of Judas's story. The translations were deliberately biased to reinforce the image of Judas as motivated purely by greed. References to any special relationship between Jesus and Judas were systematically downplayed or eliminated. This historical manipulation was so complete, so systematic, that for more than 1,500 years, virtually no one questioned the official narrative. The story of Judas as a greedy traitor had become such a fundamental truth of Christianity that questioning it was tantamount to questioning the faith itself. And that was precisely the intention. By making Judas's condemnation inseparable from the authentic Christian faith, the church authorities ensured that any attempt to rehabilitate his image or question his role would automatically be seen as an attack on Christianity itself. But now, with the rediscovery of the Gospel of Judas, this entire ideological construct, carefully constructed over centuries, is beginning to crumble. We can now clearly see how historical truth has been sacrificed on the altar of institutional power. The faith we know today is not the faith Jesus taught. It is an edited, censored, and manipulated version designed to serve the interests of those who sought to control the most powerful spiritual message the world had ever known. After exposing institutional manipulation, we come to the heart of this revelation, what the Gospel of Judas really tells us about the true nature of Jesus as a spiritual teacher and about Judas as the disciple who most deeply understood his cosmic mission. The image of Jesus that emerges from this gospel is radically different from the institutional Christ we know. Here we do not see a savior who comes to die for the sins of the world, but an enlightened master whose mission was to awaken humanity to its own inner divinity. This Jesus does not seek worshippers, he seeks initiates. He does not want blind followers, but conscious students of the cosmic mysteries. In his private conversations with Judas, Jesus reveals a sophisticated understanding of multidimensional reality that goes far beyond any traditional theology. He speaks as someone who has completely transcended the limitations of ordinary human consciousness and can now directly perceive the hidden structure of the cosmos. This Jesus understands that his physical incarnation is temporary and strategic. He is not trapped in his human body like the rest of us. He is using this material form as a tool for a specific mission. His death is not a tragedy to be avoided, but a necessary transformation that will free his cosmic essence to operate in higher dimensions of reality. But what is most revealing is how this Jesus interacts with his disciples. With most of them, including Peter, James, and John, he uses simple parables and basic moral teachings because that's all they can understand at their current level of spiritual development. But with Judas, it's completely different. With him, he shares profound esoteric knowledge because he recognizes in Judas a capacity for understanding that the others simply don't possess. This differentiation is not arbitrary or a sign of personal favoritism. It is a recognition that not all souls are at the same level of spiritual evolution. Some disciples are prepared only for elementary teachings, while others can handle revelations that would completely transform their understanding of reality. Judas emerges from this gospel as an extraordinary being, someone whose capacity for spiritual understanding surpasses even the closest disciples. It is no coincidence that Jesus chooses Judas for the most difficult and most misunderstood mission. It is precisely because Judas possesses the spiritual strength and clarity of vision necessary to execute a plan that requires sacrificing his own reputation for the sake of a greater cosmic mission. The relationship between Jesus and Judas, according to this gospel, is that of a teacher with his most advanced disciple. It is a relationship based on absolute trust, mutual understanding, and shared dedication to a purpose that transcends ordinary human concerns. Judas is not a follower who blindly obeys. He is a conscious collaborator who fully understands the implications of his actions. When Jesus asks Judas to hand him over to the authorities, it is not the request of a desperate victim. It is the instruction of a teacher to his most trusted student. Jesus knows that this action will be misinterpreted for centuries. He knows that Judas will bear the burden of being considered the greatest traitor in history. But he also knows that Judas possesses the spiritual understanding necessary to accept this sacrifice. This interpretation completely transforms our understanding of the famous kiss in the Garden of Gethsemane. It is not the cold kiss of a traitor, but the final gesture of love and respect between master and disciple before Judas executes the most difficult part of the mission. It is a moment of sacred farewell between two beings who fully understand the magnitude of what they are about to accomplish together. Judas's grief after the crucifixion, according to this perspective, is not the remorse of a traitor who has realized his error. It is the profound pain of someone who has had to participate in the physical death of his most beloved master, knowing it was necessary but experiencing all the emotional agony that such an act entails. His supposed suicide also takes on a completely different dimension. Instead of being an act of despair and guilt, it becomes the culmination of his sacrifice. Having fulfilled his mission to free the cosmic Christ from physical limitations, Judas chooses to follow his master into the higher dimensions, thus completing his own process of spiritual transformation. This revelation shows us that the true Christianity Jesus taught was not a religion of guilt and external salvation, but a path of personal enlightenment and conscious transformation. It wasn't about worshipping Jesus as an external figure, but rather following his example of awakening to one's inner divinity. The teachings Jesus shared with Judas reveal that every human being possesses the same divine potential he manifested. The difference is not one of nature, but rather of the degree of spiritual development. Jesus did not come to be worshipped as the only Son of God, but to demonstrate what we can all become when we fully awaken to our true spiritual nature. Perhaps the most profound revelation is that Judas was not the traitor, but the chosen one, the only disciple who fully understood Jesus' mission and had the spiritual courage to participate in it, even knowing the personal price he would have to pay. This understanding completely redefines what it means to be a true disciple of Christ. It is not about blind obedience to institutional dogmas, but rather about developing the capacity for spiritual understanding that allows us to consciously participate in the cosmic transformation that Jesus came to initiate. Judas represents the archetype of the enlightened disciple, someone who has transcended personal ego enough to serve a greater purpose, even when that service requires sacrifices the world cannot understand or value. In this light, the story of Judas becomes an invitation to each of us. It asks, are we willing to develop the level of spiritual understanding that allows us to see beyond appearances? Do we have the courage to serve the truth even when the world misunderstands us? Can we transcend our need for social approval to participate in something infinitely greater than ourselves? These are the questions the true Gospel of Judas poses to us. And the answers we find will determine whether we are able to access the authentic Christianity that Jesus truly taught, or whether we will remain trapped in the distorted version that institutions created to maintain their power over our souls. Now that you've learned the truth about Judas and the authentic teachings of Jesus, the most important question of all arises. What does this mean for your spiritual life today? How can this revelation transform your relationship with the divine here and now in the 21st century? The answer to this question has the power to free your soul from centuries of limiting religious programming and open you to a more authentic and transformative spiritual experience than you ever imagined possible. First, this revelation frees you from the crushing weight of religious guilt that has been imposed on humanity for millennia. You no longer need to carry the concept of original sin that makes you feel fundamentally corrupt and unworthy. By understanding that every human being possesses an inner divine spark, you can begin to relate to yourself from a place of love and respect, not self-loathing and shame. This transformation in your spiritual self-image is profoundly healing. When you realize that you are not a sinner awaiting external redemption, but a divine being in the process of remembering your true nature, everything changes. Your spiritual practice ceases to be about begging for forgiveness and becomes about exploring and developing your innate spiritual capacities. The second fundamental transformation is the liberation from the fear of divine judgment. The God who emerges from Gnostic teachings is not a harsh judge waiting to punish your mistakes, but the very source of your being, the cosmic consciousness of which you are an integral part. This understanding dissolves the paralyzing fear that has kept millions of people trapped in spiritual relationships based on terror and submission. When fear fades, a sacred space opens for a genuine relationship with the divine, based on love, curiosity, and mutual growth. You can begin to explore spiritual practices that previously seemed forbidden or dangerous: deep meditation, direct mystical experiences, communication with higher dimensions of consciousness. The third transformation is perhaps the most liberating. You no longer need intermediaries to access the divine. The teachings Jesus shared with Judas clearly demonstrate that every person can develop a direct connection with the higher dimensions of reality. You don't need priests to interpret divine will for you. You don't need institutions to control your access to the sacred. This spiritual independence doesn't mean arrogance or a rejection of shared wisdom. It means you can discern for yourself which teachings resonate with your soul and which are simply human constructs designed to control you. You develop an inner spiritual authority that allows you to navigate the maze of religious traditions with discernment and wisdom. But perhaps the most profound impact of this revelation is how it transforms your understanding of the purpose of life itself. You are no longer here simply to gain entry to heaven after death. You are here to consciously participate in the spiritual evolution of the cosmos, to awaken to your divine nature and help others do the same. This understanding makes you an active co-creator of spiritual reality, not a passive spectator waiting for salvation. Every day becomes an opportunity to develop your consciousness, expand your capacity for love, and contribute to the collective spiritual transformation of humanity. The story of Judas teaches you something fundamental about true spiritual discipleship. Sometimes serving the truth requires the courage to go against societal expectations. Sometimes the authentic spiritual path will lead you to places where you will be misunderstood, criticized, even condemned by those who remain trapped in limiting paradigms. But this apparent solitude is actually an initiation. It's an invitation to develop the inner spiritual strength that allows you to stand firm in your truth even when the entire world seems to disagree with you. It's an opportunity to transcend the need for external approval and find your authority in direct connection with the divine. In practical terms, this means you can begin to question everything you've been taught about spirituality. You can explore mystical traditions that previously seemed forbidden. You can develop your own spiritual practice based on direct experience, not inherited dogma. You can begin to meditate deeply, explore altered states of consciousness, study esoteric texts, and practice consciousness-expanding techniques that connect you directly to the higher dimensions of reality that Jesus revealed to Judas. This spiritual freedom isn't debauchery, it's responsibility. When you realize that you are a divine being with direct access to cosmic wisdom, you also realize that you are responsible for your own spiritual growth and how you use the abilities you develop. The path that opens before you is the same one Judas walked, the path of the true disciple who is willing to transcend the limitations of ordinary consciousness to access truths that transform not only his own life, but the state of consciousness of the entire planet. And now I want to connect with you from wherever you are at this moment of your spiritual awakening. I want to know from which country you're watching this video, from which corner of the world you're participating in this revelation that is shifting the collective consciousness of humanity. From which country are you watching this video? I'd love to know where we're awakening together to this spiritual truth that has been hidden for centuries. Share it in the comments, because each of you represents another light being lit in the global network of consciousnesses that are remembering the authentic truth about our divine nature. We are a planetary community of awakened souls, and it is beautiful to know that from every continent, from every culture, there are human beings who are ready to transcend traditional religious limitations and embrace the authentic spirituality that Jesus truly taught. Brother and sister, we have reached a crucial moment. After all you have discovered today, after having seen how the deepest spiritual truth has been hidden and distorted for centuries, you find yourself at a crossroads that will define the rest of your spiritual path. Today, the choice is yours. You can continue to believe the official story that has kept you in a limited spiritual box, or you can open your eyes to a truth that was silenced for centuries but is now reclaiming its place in your consciousness. This isn't simply a moment of intellectual choice about which version of history you prefer. It's a moment of soul awakening, a turning point where you decide if you're willing to transcend the limitations others have imposed on your spiritual quest. What you've learned about the Gospel of Judas is just the beginning. It's merely the first layer of a universe of spiritual truths that have been kept hidden because they represent too great a power for institutions to allow in the hands of awakened individuals. Think about what this discovery really means. All your life you've been taught to feel small, limited, and dependent on external authorities for your spiritual salvation. You've been convinced that you are fundamentally unworthy, that you need intermediaries to access the divine, that your doubts and questions are dangerous to your soul. But now you know that all of that was a construct designed to keep you under control. Now you know that you carry within you the same divine spark that Jesus manifested, the same capacity for direct connection with the sacred that Judas developed until he became the most initiated disciple. This understanding automatically makes you part of a silent revolution taking place right now across the planet. Millions of souls are simultaneously awakening to these truths that have lain dormant for millennia. You are witnessing and participating in a spiritual renaissance that will transform human consciousness forever. But with this revelation also comes a responsibility. You cannot simply be a passive spectator of your own awakening. You cannot know these truths and continue living as if nothing has changed. Authentic knowledge transforms, and transformation requires action. Action doesn't necessarily mean dramatically changing your external life. It means beginning to live from this new level of spiritual understanding. It means developing your capacity for direct connection with the divine. It means exploring the dimensions of consciousness that traditional religions have taught you to fear. It means becoming an authentic seeker of truth, not a blind follower of pre-established dogmas. It means developing the spiritual discernment that allows you to distinguish between teachings that genuinely elevate your consciousness and those that simply seek to control you. The path that opens before you is the same one followed by true mystics of all traditions, the path of direct experience of the sacred. It is a path that requires courage, because it will take you beyond the spiritual comfort zones that society considers safe. But it is also a path of indescribable freedom and joy. When you develop your own authentic connection with the divine, when you directly access the higher dimensions of consciousness, when you experience for yourself the truth of your infinite spiritual nature, everything changes. You no longer live in the spiritual fear that characterizes traditional religiosity. You no longer depend on the interpretations of others to understand divine will. You no longer need to look outside yourself for what was always available within you. You become what Judas was for Jesus, a conscious collaborator, in the spiritual transformation of the cosmos. You become a channel for these hidden truths to manifest in the world through your life, your choices, and your relationships with other seekers. This is your personal invitation to authentic awakening. It is not an invitation to follow another religion or belief system. It is an invitation to transcend all religious limitations and access directly the source of all true spirituality. It's an invitation to remember who you really are, not a sinner seeking redemption, but a divine being in the process of remembering your true nature, not a follower waiting for external instructions, but a conscious co-creator of spiritual reality. The world urgently needs people who have awakened to these truths. It needs human beings who can see beyond traditional religious illusions and live from an authentic understanding of what it means to be truly spiritual. You may be one of those people. In fact, the simple fact that you've made it this far in the video, that you've remained open to these revelations, despite how challenging they may be for your previous programming, shows that your soul is already ready for this awakening. The question remains, are you going to answer this call? If this revelation has resonated deep within your soul, if you feel that something fundamental has shifted in your spiritual understanding during these few minutes we have shared, then what I am about to tell you now is absolutely crucial to your awakening. What you have just discovered about the Gospel of Judas is only a tiny fraction of the spiritual truths that have been hidden from humanity. It is merely the tip of the iceberg of an ocean of sacred knowledge that can transform not only your life, but your entire understanding of reality itself. For centuries, extraordinary texts, profound mystical teachings, and revelations that could revolutionize human consciousness have remained buried, censored, deliberately kept out of reach. But now, in this era of global awakening, these truths are emerging one by one from the shadows where they were hidden. And here's your chance to be part of this historic rediscovery. Here's your invitation to join the most important community of your life, the community of authentic seekers who have decided they will no longer accept censored versions of spiritual truth. I invite you, I beg you, I implore you, subscribe to this channel right now, not as a mere passive follower of content, but as an active participant in your own spiritual awakening. Every video I publish has been carefully researched and designed to take you a step deeper in your understanding of who you really are and what your true purpose in this universe is. When you subscribe, you're not just following a YouTube channel. You're enrolling in a spiritual university where each class brings you closer to complete liberation from the limitations that have imprisoned your soul for decades, perhaps your entire life. Turn on notifications because what's coming is urgent. The revelations I'm preparing for the next videos are so powerful, so transformative, that every day you go without access to them is a day lost in your spiritual evolution. But here's what you really need to understand. This isn't just educational content. This is medicine for your soul. Each revelation I'll share with you in future videos has been specifically chosen because it has the power to heal deep spiritual wounds and to release blocks to your consciousness you didn't even know you had. In the next video, I'm going to reveal something even more shocking than what you've discovered today. I'm going to show you another ancient text that not only confirms everything you've just learned about Judas, but also reveals secrets about the true nature of Jesus that will completely revolutionize your understanding of Christianity. I'm going to show you documented evidence that Jesus not only taught advanced consciousness-expanding techniques to his closest disciples, but that these techniques are still practiced today. I'm going to give you access to specific methods of spiritual transformation that were deliberately eliminated from official Christian tradition. But what is coming is too powerful, too revolutionary to be shared casually. I am only willing to reveal it to those who have demonstrated a serious commitment to the search for truth, only to those who have made the conscious decision to become part of this community of authentic seekers. That's why I need you to subscribe right now, not as a formality, but as a declaration of your spiritual intention, as an affirmation that you're ready to discover truths that will change your life forever. Because let me be completely honest with you, once you see what I have in store for the next video, once you access those teachings that have been hidden for millennia, you will no longer be able to live in the spiritual ignorance that characterizes most of humanity. You will awaken to capacities of your consciousness that you didn't even know existed. You will develop forms of perception that will allow you to directly see the higher dimensions of reality. You will experience states of connection with the divine that go far beyond anything traditional religions consider possible. And it all starts with a simple decision you need to make right now. Click the subscribe button and prove that you're ready for the next level of your spiritual awakening. Click on the next video that appears on your screen right now. Don't wait. Don't put it off. Don't let doubts or fears prevent you from accessing what could be the most important information you'll ever receive. Because what comes next, brother, what comes next is going to change everything. The truth is waiting for you. Your soul is ready. You just need to make the decision. Will you do it? Thank you for watching this video until the end. We will see you in the next video.